And with that, we will move on to our final report, and we'll have the State Auditor's Office come forward to present their report on civil asset forfeiture, strengthening transparency and protections for property owners. And when you're ready, please proceed.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Scott Frank. I'm the Director of Performance and IT Audit here at the Washington State Auditor's Office. I'm here today with Sahara Monahan and Tanya Fleming, who are going to go over the bulk of the results of this audit. This performance audit examined 8 police agencies to better understand the characteristics of civil asset forfeiture here in Washington, and to also identify opportunities to address any potential due process concerns for people facing civil asset forfeiture. So you see here, this is a listing of the entities that were included in the audit: 4 police departments, 2 sheriff's offices, 1 state agency, and 1 task force. Before we really get into this, I would like to thank the staff and management of each of these agencies for their assistance and cooperation throughout the audit. And now I'm going to pass this over to Sahara, who is going to provide some background and key results on the characteristics of civil asset forfeitures.
Thank you, Scott. Some background. Civil asset forfeiture is a legal tool that allows the police to seize and forfeit property that they believe has been involved in or is the proceeds of a crime. Back in the 1980s, civil asset forfeiture was intended to target criminal organizations such as drug cartels and large-scale drug distributors. But the use of this tool has evolved over time to deter any level of criminal activity. Examples of property the police can seize and forfeit includes cash, weapons, vehicles, homes, and personal items. Under Washington drug forfeiture statute, which is the most frequently used and the emphasis for this audit, police agencies can seize and forfeit property without securing an arrest, charge, or criminal conviction of the property owner. During the review period, police agencies across the state received nearly $40 million in revenue from civil asset forfeitures. Several states have examined the use of civil asset forfeiture and raised concerns that have led to legislative reforms in how that tool is used. We will talk about some of those reforms later in the presentation, but a few examples of concerns that the states have raised include the lack of a criminal conviction requirement to deprive people of their property, the apparent conflict of interest that exists when the same police agency that seizes property is also allowed to make the decision to retain it, and the disproportionate effect civil asset forfeiture has on some racial and ethnic groups. We examined the use of civil asset forfeiture in Washington to get an understanding of the characteristics of civil asset forfeitures law enforcement agencies conduct, and to identify opportunities to address due process concerns with Washington's civil asset forfeiture system. Here is a summary of our key results, and as you will note, most of these results speak primarily to how the system is set up. We found that police agencies primarily seize cash and other property of low monetary value. In some communities, civil asset forfeitures disproportionately affected some racial and ethnic groups. The state civil asset forfeiture law provides the police with broad authority to seize and forfeit property and few protections for property owners. The audited police agencies follow due process requirements in state law, but could do more to help ensure that people receive notice of the police intent to forfeit property and to help people understand what they need to do to reclaim their property. And last, state law does not require police agencies to collect some key data on civil asset forfeiture, nor make the data they do collect available online, both steps necessary to improve transparency. In the next few slides, I'm going to provide a high-level overview of the type of property the police agencies are seizing, the value of the property, and from whom police agencies are seizing property. We found that cash is the most common type of property police agencies seize from property owners. Cash accounted for nearly 3/4 of all property seized during the review period. Agency officials said that officers primarily seize cash because it's the most common type of evidence of suspected illegal activity they find at the scene. When examining the value of the property seized, we found that more than half of all civil asset forfeiture cases involve property worth less than $2,000. While some high-value dollar cases did occur, they were less frequent, and one agency, the Port of Seattle Police Department, accounted for most of the high-dollar value cases, primarily due to its jurisdiction at the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Various factors may contribute to low-value property seizures, including the nature of common circumstances where seizures are happening, such as during a traffic stop, when the police pull someone over for a traffic infraction, or when in a police encounter with somebody that is suspected of selling drugs on the streets, or through a police investigation of someone that is suspected of growing cannabis in their home. Some agency officials said that they find lower value cases with clear ownership easier to prove compared to large-scale cases that involve traffickers that are skilled at evading detection. And last, low-value property seizures may be more common because neither state law nor agency's policies forbid them. The audited police agencies do not collect data on the race and ethnicity of people who had property seized. So to gain an understanding of who is affected by civil asset forfeitures, we use an alternative method that analyzes U.S. Census data on surnames and the racial and ethnic makeup of geographic locations where people live to estimate people's probable race and ethnicity. This method has been used by research institutions and government agencies such as the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau when demographic information is not available. This is the same method the office used to estimate the race and ethnicity of voters who had their ballots rejected in the rejected ballots performance audit. We found that in some communities, civil asset forfeitures, people of certain races and ethnicity experience civil asset forfeitures at much higher rates when compared to their presence in the local population. For example, with 5 of the audited agencies, the share of civil asset forfeitures that involve people who were Black, Hispanic, or of Asian and Pacific Islander descent surpassed the representation in the local population by more than 10 percentage points. With 2 of the audited agencies, that share of civil asset forfeitures for people who were white surpassed the representation in the local population by 9 percentage points. As previously mentioned, a key concern about civil asset forfeitures is a lack of a criminal conviction requirement to deprive people of their property. We found that of the nearly 1,000 people who faced civil asset forfeiture with the audited agencies, only 25% of them were convicted of a crime related to that forfeiture. And with that, I'm going to pass the presentation to Tanya, who is going to talk about aspects of state law in agencies' processes where we identified opportunities to strengthen protections for property owners.
Thank you, and thank you, members of the committee and chair. There are 3 structural aspects of state law that I'll focus on today. The first is a low standard of evidence. The second is how, in most cases, forfeiture decisions are made by the police agency. And last, how proceeds from forfeitures can create financial incentives. State law gives police broad authority by having a relatively low standard of evidence, known as preponderance of evidence. This means that evidence must only show that it is more likely than not that property was used for or was bought with money from criminal activity. 29 states and the District of Columbia have higher standards of evidence in Washington, starting from requiring a clear and convincing evidence all the way up to requiring a criminal conviction before property is forfeited. These higher standards of evidence are meant to provide greater protections to property owners. One essential element of due process is ensuring that cases are heard by an impartial decision maker. However, state law gives police broad authority by allowing the same agency that seized property to also decide if they have enough evidence to keep it. We reviewed 40 forfeiture cases, and in almost all, someone employed by or contracted by the agency made the decision that they had enough evidence to keep the property. State law also allows police to forfeit property by default or dispose of that property by default. This typically happens in cases when a property owner does not file a claim or they file a claim that is late. For many of the cases that we reviewed, agencies retained property by default because an owner had not filed a claim. Statute also allows these cases to be heard judicially in a court, but this only happens if a property owner understands that this is an option and they request the option. In the cases we reviewed, no property owners had their case heard in court. Some states have addressed conflict of interest concerns by requiring that agencies that are independent of law enforcement make those forfeiture decisions. They require that cases go through the court system or through another administrative process that is not managed by a police agency. Here in Washington, one agency, the State Patrol, follows a hybrid approach that partially addresses some of these conflict of interest concerns by having the Office of Administrative Hearings, which is a separate state agency, hear cases if an owner files a claim and they request a hearing. In several other cases, the State Patrol still makes some of those decisions. This third area of law that provides police broad authority creates concerns about financial incentives. State law allows agencies to retain 90% of the proceeds from forfeitures. The remaining 10% gets sent to the state treasurer. Combined, the 8 agencies that we reviewed reported receiving nearly $13 million from civil asset forfeitures during our review period. This was not a particularly large share of their revenue. For most agencies, this in fact represented a very small amount. It was typically less than 1% of the agency's total spending. Most agencies mentioned using those funds for additional equipment, salaries, and other operating costs. Some states have tried to address these concerns by requiring that all or a significant portion of these funds are deposited into neutral accounts that are not managed by police. These accounts could look like victim compensation funds, substance control programs, or even the education or general fund. Now I'll walk through how agencies measure up against state requirements around due process. As a quick summary, we didn't see many issues where agencies were not following the law. Agencies need to do 2 things before they can forfeit property. The first is send notices to property owners, and then second, inform property owners of their right to a hearing. In all of the cases we looked at, agencies generally follow these requirements, as well as a few others that we looked at. So we know that agencies are following state requirements, but experts recommend additional practices to help provide civil protections to property owners. These aren't required by any means, but they would provide more protections to owners. They suggest first, making sure that notices are delivered, and second, making sure that notices are understandable. Of the 40 cases that we reviewed, we had some strong indications that some people did not receive these notices. 5 notices were returned. Nearly 10% of notices had addresses that were missing things like zip codes or building numbers. So it's possible that people did not receive this notice or that it was delivered. In other cases, to improve the chances of successful delivery, we did see some agencies delivering notices in person or sending these notices via certified mail, which is in line with leading practices. Only a few agencies had practices to help make notices understandable, including things such as making it a standard practice to provide languages other than English, using plain talk. None of the notices that we looked at mentioned some key rights that property owners have, such as being able to move the case to court or the ability to have the attorney's fees reimbursed if the owner wins the case. Agencies are required to send reports to the state treasurer each quarter with some limited information, such as basic descriptions of the property forfeited and amount of money received. Leading practices, however, suggest that agencies track detailed data, such as whether civil and criminal outcomes are associated with forfeitures. They also suggest tracking how proceeds are spent and also making sure that those statewide reports are publicly available online. Aside from the limited data that agencies report, Washington does not require collecting or reporting any of these other items. We made a series of recommendations for the legislature and police agencies, the details of which can be found in our report. But as a summary, for the legislature, we recommend convening a work group of stakeholders to address issues such as conflict of interest concerns, safeguards for property owners, and issues related to potential financial incentives. In addition to that work group, we recommend that police agencies develop written guidance for delivering notices, send notices in plain talk, and provide information to owners about some of their key essential rights. One note that I'd like to make about these recommendations is that we consider the audit results broad enough that we suggest that all police agencies in the state consider the recommendations and the practices found throughout our report. With that, Scott will end our presentation with a few thoughts.
Yeah, I wanted to comment. So as part of our audit process, just like as is the case with your staff when they conduct their audits, we provide final draft of our reports to the audited agencies, offer the management an opportunity to respond and offer their comments. In this case, and this is certainly their prerogative, some of the agencies expressed areas of concern and disagreement with the report. These concern broadly fell into 4 areas, which are listed on the slide. They're discussed in more detail in the report itself, but I wanted to take a moment to comment on a couple of them. The first one is there were some concerns about the independence of the audit. 2 agencies questioned our independence and expressed concerns about bias. These were primarily concerned with groups that we contacted during the planning of the audit and then the final findings and conclusions that are included in the audit. This is the one we probably take the most seriously. This is a serious allegation, one of bias, and one that we think is really without merit. We did indeed solicit input from stakeholders during our planning process who have been critical of the institution of civil asset forfeiture, but we also talked to stakeholders who are very supportive of the institution, as well as folks that, like legislators who represent the general public. As part of our outreach, this is for us to get a grounding in a topic and kind of figure out how we might approach auditing the topic. However, the findings and conclusions in the report are not based on that outreach or who we talked to early on. Instead, it is supported by the evidence and analysis that we conduct throughout the audit and are presented in the report. The second one I wanted to comment on were concerns about the recommendations to the legislature. So we make a group of recommendations, as Tanya noted, both to the legislature to convene a work group and to the individual agencies to do some things to help improve the process. I would say that in general, there tended to be agreement with most of the recommendations to the specific agencies. Not unanimous, but there definitely tended to be agreement there. But they expressed a lot of concerns about the recommendations to the legislature, and we just want to make a clarification. We're recommending the legislature convene a work group because we are suggesting you take a look at some systemic issues here and decide which, if any, you would want to address. We do believe, as the audited agencies indicated, that law enforcement should be represented in such a work group. This would be too important of an endeavor not to include their perspective in there. And so we just wanted to make sure that, in many of their comments, they expressed a concern that they would be left out. And while we didn't say who should be in a work group in our recommendation, we absolutely think that law enforcement would need to be a part of that. That with our next this is our contact information, and we are happy to answer questions when the chair deems it time.
Thank you for your presentation, and that time would be now. We do have one member with a question. I will just ask if other members have questions to please use your raise hand feature in Zoom, or just wave at me if you're in the room. Representative McClintock.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation and the information. Is there any way we could get a list of actual, just by name, of all the stakeholders that you used instead of the summary that you provided?
Yes, we can provide you with a list of everyone we talked to. Yes.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you.
And next will be Representative Paulette, followed by Senator Hasagawa.
Thank you. If I could do the two-handed two questions. I just want to start by commending you on what I thought was a very thorough audit that looked and compared our state as well with other states for us as decision makers, as well as looking at due process issues. So thank you. And my questions have to do with the responses. First question is there any linkage that you saw in your research between civil asset forfeiture and illicit drug trafficking in terms of forfeiture reducing drug trafficking, as was implied in some of the responses? And let me just stop there for the first question.
The short answer is no. In fact, there was a study on New Mexico, which is the state that abolished civil asset forfeiture. They only allow forfeitures on their criminal statute, and they did a comparison of crime rates when civil asset forfeiture was in place and after, a year or two after civil asset forfeiture was abolished, and they did not find any increases in crime after the civil asset forfeiture was abolished. That's the only one we came across during our research that tried to do that linkage. Yeah.
I would want to clarify, though, just that drawing that connection was not something that we were trying to do as part of the audit. So it would been something we came across in our background work, but not something that we explicitly evaluated.
And if I may ask, second question.
Please proceed.
Closely related, which is is there any linkage in terms of reduction in criminal activity if the proceeds of crime are forfeited and go to criminal victim accounts or other accounts rather than going to the local law enforcement agency that forfeits, that goes through the process?
That's not something that we came across in our research, and we did not examine that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Hasagawa.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I don't actually have a question. I just wanted to thank the auditors for looking at the disparate impacts of the way the civil asset forfeiture has been playing out. It may be a lesser known fact in the House, but in the Senate, Senator Patterson and I have been co-sponsoring legislation on civil asset forfeiture reform for many years. Unfortunately, Senator Patton won't be with us next session, but I was wondering if the auditor's office does get involved with proposing request legislation out of their recommendations.
That's not something that we would do. We put the information out there for you all to make the decisions on that. But once we've put that out there, we don't want to get into advocating one way or another as far as how you might address those. And so we wouldn't prepare the draft legislation. But we'd be happy to talk, if you were working with anyone on that, we'd certainly be happy to talk, to share our insights.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, are there any other member questions for the State Auditor's Office? I'm not seeing any, so I am going to thank the State Auditor's Office for your report, for your work on this.